All right, we are recording. We just finished chapter 8. We are about to start chapter 9. The next exam is going to cover chapters 8, 9, and 10. So we're almost to the midway point of the next exam. The next attendance word will be below, like not above, but below. Anyway, let's jump into chapter 9. The good thing about this is if you've already at least done the pre-lab and read the lab, you already have an introduction into what we're about to talk about, which is genetics. And to me, this is one of the more interesting concepts of this semester because everything that you learn affects you. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to learn it. But genetics is one of those things you can really see. You can look at your parents and look at you and see differences. And you can look at people who are dying from COVID versus people who barely get affected by COVID and realize that it's some of that, there's a genetic component to it. But here we go. Chapter 9, Patterns of Inheritance, aka genetics. Your book always starts off with some pictures, some guessing games. I might do that. Let's address some of these. How would you describe this woman's hair color? I would too. Now, my wife would probably be more
burgundy.
See, yeah. Somebody might be more specific, like, that's actually this. It might be burgundy. I don't know. Burgundy, red. I don't know. Now, do you think if she and a man who had the same exact hair color, do you think if they had kids, that the kids would turn out with hair color like that?
Yeah.
I hear a yes online. Maybe it's a little bit harder to see in person or than it is in person. Schmidt's shaking his head no.
Was it natural?
That's a great question. Was it natural? My guess is no. So let's just assume it's not. To me, that looks like it came out of a box or from a salon. So let's assume it's not natural. Then I repose the question. Do you think her kids are going to come out with that hair color?
No.
All right, I agree. And look at these awesome tattoos. Right, she's got some tattoos. Let's say she and her mate also have tattoos. Well, her mate also has tattoos. Do you think the baby's going to come out with tattoos?
No.
No, right? Because even though that is a change that is made to her body, in his body, the one who's not shown, it's not genetic, right? And that's one of the things you're going to learn. Even though you already know that, we're going to talk about that, right? We're going to talk about how changes have to be certain changes for them to be passed down from generation to generation. I don't even remember what your book was getting at with this picture. I think we're just talking about how, you can see multiple generations here. I think what your book was getting at was sort of what we talked about in the last chapter where, because of sexual reproduction and because we have this diversity that every time you go down and you have descendants, things are slightly different, right? The farther you get away from a descendant, the more different you are. There's still some similarities, but you're different the farther you go down from your descendants. I think that's what your book was getting at. If somebody's read it, you can correct me if I'm wrong. It's not important for the grand scheme of this chapter. And then this picture, if I remember correctly, obviously that's the dad, and then there's a baby. And if I remember correctly, that baby is a female. And what your book was getting at here was that if you are a female, it was because of your dad. It's your dad's contribution to the fertilization. It's the sperm that determines whether you're going to be a male or a female. And you're going to learn about that in this chapter. That being said, though, the information I've already given you about the X chromosome and the Y chromosome, if you really thought about it, you could figure that out on your own, but we're going to learn about it anyway. So that's just the introduction. Let's skip ahead. Your book always starts off with this, biology and society, to give you some sort of topic that they think you might be interested in. We're going to skip it as always. It is slightly interesting, though. You might read it, especially if you're into dogs. You could look into artificial selection. It might be something to read about if you want to, or write about for independent work. Talks about where dogs came from, a common ancestor from a wolf. Anyway, let's get into it. I like how your book presents this chapter. It presents it almost like a storyline because we're going to learn about this guy named Mendel, who is pretty much the father of genetics. So rather than just telling you this, that, and the other thing about genetics, your book kind of presents it as a story. Like Mendel did this, Mendel did that. Here were his hypotheses. Here's how he tested them. And here's some of the conclusions he came up with. So that's what we're going to talk about. I probably won't even ask you about Mendel. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through it. There's his picture at the top right. There's old Mendel. Anyway, Here's some stuff you do need to know, and you've been introduced to it in lab already. Heredity is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. I can almost guarantee you I will not ask you the definition of heredity on the exam. It's just a word that we will use. Therefore, you need to know what it means when we use it. Most of you probably already knew what heredity meant, even if you couldn't define it. Like if I asked you to give me the definition, you maybe not been able to give me the words, but you probably knew what it meant. You'll encounter that a lot in the second half of this semester. A lot of these words that we use, if I were to ask you the definition, you might not be able to give it to me, but you know what it means. If that's what heredity is, then genetics is the study of heredity. So we're studying the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. And these days, it's even more interesting than it used to be, because it used to be you were literally just looking at, you would look at the matings. Like, all right, this person mated with that person. This person had this trait, that person had that trait, and then their offspring had these traits. And you would just look at it that way. Now that we know what we know about DNA and we have the technology that we can do, we actually look at it a little bit harder. My thesis work in grad school was on genetics. That brings us to Gregory Mendel. You don't need to know about him. I'm not going to ask you any questions about him. But again, your book presents this as sort of like a story, so I'm going to present it like a story as well. He did his work in the 1860s. That number is not important for the exam.
Mr. Hello.
Yeah.
Something came up and I had to leave class. Can I just answer the questions later and watch the video?
Yeah, no problem. I hope everything's okay.
All right, thank you.
So yeah, he did his work in the 1860s. That's not important for the exam, actually, and that's something you could also completely forget and completely understand everything up and coming. But it is an interesting number. Later on, you'll see, oh, while he was doing this, someone else was doing that, and that's slightly interesting. So remember it if you want, but brain dump it if you want to. Anyway, in the 1860s, he argued that parents pass their unique genes to offspring. I put a little star next to genes because he didn't call them genes. We didn't know what a gene was yet. I think he called them heritable traits. Doesn't matter. But that was a unique thought back then. Everybody knew, though. I mean, even before the 1860s, obviously you could tell, that mom and that dad got together and had that baby, and you could see some of the traits. Like, oh, yeah, look at that fire engine red. Well, I guess they wouldn't have fire engines back then, but look at that really bright red hair that daughter got from that dad or whatever, right? They knew it. But he was the first person, at least on record, to say that they were passing on something unique, right? Not just a trait, but there was something inside of them, inside their cells, that was responsible for this. It was the genes that were responsible for these inherited traits, like for the red hair that I was just mentioning, for example. And again, he didn't call them genes, but we know that they're genes, so I'm going to refer to them as genes. He also argued that genes retain their individual identities generation after generation, no matter how they're mixed up or temporarily masked. For example, do any of you have blue eyes but have parents with brown eyes? I guess not. I do. Both my parents have brown eyes. And it's not that my gene was like just some new gene, like my mom and my dad got together and some new gene showed up. No, what happened was there was a gene that they had that they weren't expressing that was hidden in their cells, basically. And when their two cells came together in fertilization, they made me. And then those genes showed up, and then there's blue eyes, right? So that's what he means by genes retain their individual identities generation after generation, no matter how they're mixed up, which is another good thing to think about. You might have a trait that neither of your parents have because it may have been hidden. You might have a grandparent trait, which is what mine was, right? I got mine from my grandparents, my eyes from my grandparents. Any questions about this slide? All right. For the exam, it's almost a useless slide. For understanding what we're about to talk about, it's important that you understand what the word heredity and genetics means because we're going to use them. And then all this stuff about Gregory Mendel, not important at this moment because we're going to talk about all that stuff here in more detail. All right. He did his work in a place called Abbey Garden. So that's why your book titled this little section, In Abbey Garden. Mendel studied garden peas. You don't need to know that. I'm not going to ask you about what he studied. We are going to talk about why he studied garden peas and all that and how it worked. But for the grand scheme of this semester, it's not important to remember what kind of plant he used. But why did he do it? Well, he did it because, first of all, they're easy to grow. So imagine if he decided he was going to study, I don't know, redwood forest, or redwood trees, right? Those huge ones, hundreds of feet tall. That wouldn't make sense. Those are not easy to grow. You might be able to get a little sapling. It'll take hundreds of years before it's fully grown. You know, you'll be dead before it's fully grown. Plus, where are you going to keep it? Plus, that's only one red tree. You know, he needed thousands of plants. So yeah, easy to grow. How many of you grow house plants, and some of them are really hard to keep alive? Nobody? I do. I have most of mine are pretty easy. I think my hardest is an orchid. I have an orchid that's, I don't know, I'm just not good with orchids. Anyway, point is, obviously, if you're going to study plants, you want plants that are easy to grow. Also, they come in many readily distinguishable varieties. So, for example, you might not want to study, if you're looking at different traits and you're looking at genetics, heredity in plants, you might not want to use Bermuda grass, for example, right? Because grass is just grass, especially if it's that one species. Like, what are you going to look at the differences? Like, yeah, that one's green. That one has long, straight green leaves, and so do its offspring, right? That's not going to help you if you're looking at traits. So, yeah, you need many readily distinguishable varieties. And again, if this thing was working, I would put an X through that to show you that you don't need to know that for the exam. I'm still just introducing you to what you're about to learn. Here's what you do need to know, not just for the exam, but to understand what I'm saying in the upcoming chapter. You need to know the difference between a character and a trait. And I should have discussed this more in the lab now that I think about it. But a character is a heritable feature that varies among individuals. So, for example, eye color is a character. Chin, and I'll come back to this, but your chin is a character. Your hairline is a character. Your thumb is a character. Your little fingers are a character. I'm going to come back to that. But a character is a feature that varies among individuals. Hair color is a hair color. Hair color is a hair color. That is true. But hair color is a character. And that brings us to the next word, which is related, and it is trait. That is the variant of a character. So if eye color is a character, then blue is a trait. Brown is a trait. Green is a trait. If hair color is a character, blonde is a trait. Brown is a trait. Red is a trait. So on and so forth. Chin, since I already used that as an example. Chin is a character. Dimpled is a trait. Or smooth is a trait. So make sure you understand the differences between those words. Character and trait.
So is height a character?
Height, that is a great question. And yes, height would be a character. And tall could be a trait. Short could be a trait. And I will mention this. We're going to come back to the idea of height. So for now, purge your brain of the idea of height being genetic. We use it as an example, but it's not a great example, and you'll see why at the end of the semester. The end of the chapter. All right. Moving forward. Great question. Oh, here's another thing. So when Mendel was looking at these pea plants and doing his studies, he was looking at characters that only had two distinct traits, which is a perfect timing. Now that I think about it, that was a great time for you to answer or ask that question. He would not study height in humans, right? Because there are not two distinct traits. It's not like every human is either 6'5" or 5'5", and the two traits are tall or short, right? It's everywhere in between, so that wouldn't be good. Even eye color wouldn't be good, because at the very least, to make it simple, you could say we have blue, brown, and green, right? Those are three different traits. Not to mention the fact that there's all kinds of different shades of blue and brown and all that. Or hair color, right? Even if you were to simplify it and say the only hair colors are black, brown, and blonde and red, that's still more than two traits, right? So he kept it very simple. He was looking at things that only had two traits, sort of like the things that we looked at in lab. Like you either had a chin dimple or you didn't. You either had a widow's peak or you didn't. You either had a bent thumb, hitchhiker's thumb, or you didn't, right? Two distinct traits. That's what he looked at. And it keeps things much simpler. And of course, towards the end of the semester, We will start looking at things that have more than two distinct traits. But for now, we're going to focus on those two distinct traits. Any questions about this slide? Again, for the exam and for understanding what's about to come up in this chapter, the most important thing is that you understand the relationship between the terms character and trait. Okay. An important advantage of pea plants is that he was able to strictly control the reproduction. Now, if you're taking notes, you can give your note-taking hand a break. None of this will be on the exam, and honestly, really even understanding it is not important for understanding the rest of the chapter or the rest of the semester. But your book talked about it, so did I. Because again, we're talking about why did he use pea plants? Well, again, one of the important things, if you're looking at heredity, you want to be able to control the reproduction. You want to make sure that this plant is reproducing with that plant, right? Which you can't really do out in the wild. Well, you could, but it'll be harder. But because you never know, right? Pollen, the flowers open up. You never know which plant is reproducing with which plant. I'm just going to skip to the next slide because the picture makes more sense than the words that are just written on this, especially if you're not familiar with plant anatomy. So here we go. Here's a typical flower, or specifically a pea flower. We have the stamen. That's the male parts, a bunch of little male parts. We have the carpel, right? That's the female part. So this flower is both male and female. That's normal in a plant. And of course, you have the petal that keeps it open or keeps it enclosed. So what happens is these petals open up and then the sex parts are exposed. And what normally happens in nature is once those sex parts are exposed, then you get sperm, aka pollen, from a different plant that makes its way here, right, to this female part. Or the sperm from this flower makes its way to some other flower, whether it's through wind or butterflies or bees or whatever the case may be. The pollen goes from one plant to the other. That's basically plant sex. And of course, sometimes this male part can inseminate that female part. So in a sense, if you think about it that way, a plant can have sex with itself, if you think about it like that. Anyway, again, none of this is important for the exam. But the reason Mendel used these pea plants, another one of the reasons is he could control the reproduction. How? Well, he can cut off the female parts, cut off the male parts to make sure, for example, that this purple plant is not having sex with itself, so to speak. It's not reproducing with itself. You can make sure this white flowered plant is not mating with itself, and he can control it. He can take the pollen from this white flowered plant and put it on the female part of that purple flower plant, and he knows that that is the reproduction. He knows that that white flowered plant mated with that purple flower plant because he controlled it. So again, for the exam and for understanding what's about to come up, this is not important. I guess the only reason this would be important is if you had a really inquisitive student and they might think to themselves, well, hold on, he did all this work, but how did he know this plant had sex with that plant? And I'm saying had sex, but they didn't really have sex. They mated, they reproduced. So yeah, an inquisitive student, somebody who doubts everything, maybe that's what this is for, right? Well, for you doubters, this is how we did it. Anyway, he controlled the mating. What happens with the mating? Well, you end up with little pea pods, right? And each one of these peas, we might think of them as food, but each pea is really a seed. And really, what is a seed? A seed is the baby plant. So that's a little baby plant. That's a little baby plant. That's a little baby plant, right? So on and so forth. That's what a seed is. And of course, because it's a little baby plant, you plant one of those peas, you get a whole plant. You plant another one, you get a whole plant. There's some other things right here. You can see that there's a P in parentheses and there's an F1 in parentheses. Don't worry about that. You're going to learn what that is soon, but not at this very moment. So any questions about this slide? All right. You guys are keeping it easy, assuming you're awake. Created. All right. So we're still talking about what he did in Abbey Garden. He created what we call purebred varieties of plants. You need to know what purebred means. One, because if you don't understand what that word means, you won't be able to understand what I'm talking about in this chapter. Two, there's definitely a question on the study guide that asks you what a purebred plant is. And three, I might ask you on the exam. Purebred plants self-fertilize to produce offspring identical to the parent. Meaning, if you use your brain and try to picture that slide I just showed you. There was a purple flower and a white flower. So if that white flower was a purebred plant, then if we were to take that white flower and open it up and make it reproduce with itself, right? Take the pollen from its male parts and put it on its female parts, then 100% of its offspring would be white flowered. 100%. That means it's purebred. There are no hidden alleles. There are no hidden traits. It's just purebred white flowered plant. And it's actually, it's funny. I only have like one bullet point for this. But in all actuality, it probably took him a long time to do that. He probably had to, like, again, using the white flower as an example, he probably had to breed those plants over and over and over and over and over again until finally he was able to come up with plants that every time he self-fertilized them, they came out completely white. And then he finally got there. And then once he had all these purebred varieties, not just of the white flower, a lot of different things, but once he had the purebred varieties, he then crossed 2 different purebred varieties. So again, sticking with the same example, the one with the purple flower could have been purebred purple flower. The other one was purebred white flower. And then he could cross them, knowing that he crossed a purebred and a purebred, right? It's not like he went out into the wild and picked some purple flower and then went out into the wild and picked some white flower. No, this was scientific. He knew it was a purebred purple and a purebred white. And what is the result when you cross 2 purebreds? It's another word that you need to know, definitely for the study guide, maybe for the exam, definitely to understand the rest of this chapter. The word is hybrid. The hybrid is the offspring of 2 different purebred varieties. You need to know what that means. All right, the next word for attendance is Andre 3000. Now then, moving past it, we know what a purebred is. We know what a hybrid is. So, and those are nouns, right? A hybrid is a noun. It's what you get when you cross 2 purebreds. A purebred is a noun. It's it's pure. It only has that one trait. So what do you call it though? What is the verb or what is the action of crossing 2 purebreds? That is called, actually not even just purebreds, but when we're doing this, when we're mating these plants, we call that a genetic cross. Now that's a little bit less important as far as words are concerned. I don't think it's on the study guide. I'm not going to ask it on the exam. Plus, even though that's the word, genetic cross, I'm probably going to use different words. Like I might say that those 2 plants mated, or I might incorrectly say they had sex, or, I might say they reproduced. So that's a little bit less of an important word because, again, I'll probably use different variations of that. This one's important. If we're talking about a purebred variety, like if we're talking about this action of taking 2 purebreds and crossing them to make a hybrid, well, we have names for that generation. That purebred generation, those parental plants, we call that the P generation. And I guess the way you can remember that is P for purebred or P for parental, however you want to remember it. Just remember that the first generation we're talking about is called the P generation. So again, we cross 2 purebred plants in a genetic cross. And that's the P generation, right? And then the P generation has offspring, which are hybrids, by the way. And those offspring, that generation is called the F1 generation. And then we can cross those offspring with each other. And then we get the F2 generation. So really just need to remember what order it's in. First it's P, then F1, then F2. And again, I'm probably not going to ask you that on the exam. But if I do, I'm not going to try to trick you. So it's not like you remember specifically that it's F1 and F2. Like the choices on the exam are not going to be, is it F1 or is it P1 or is it, I don't know, T1? Nothing like that. Just remember it goes P and then F1 and then F2. And honestly, again, that's a little bit less important because I'm not going to be trying to trick you with this. And every time I talk about this scenario, I'm going to be very clear which generation is which. I would also point out, too, just for your own knowledge, not for the sake of the exam, but This is a very simplified version of the way plant genetics works. It's not always that you have the two purebreds and then you cross them and then you have an F1 generation and then you cross them with each other to have an F2 generation. Sometimes there's like all kinds of back and forth stuff. Maybe you might have the F1 generation and you take a plant from the F1 generation and cross it with a P generation. And then what do you call those offspring, right? It gets very complicated. We don't get into it. You are getting the easy version of how this works. Any questions about what's on this slide? All right. Here's the more important stuff as far as the exam is concerned, as far as what's a little bit harder to understand, as far as what's more important for understanding the rest of the semester. What we're about to jump into is much more important. Mendel's law of segregation. And this first slide is kind of like an introduction. We're not getting into the important stuff yet, just kind of easing you into it. Mendel performed experiments in which he tracked the inheritance of characters, for example, flower color, and that's the one we're going to keep going back to, even though there's a bunch of different things he did, that occur as two alternative traits. So nothing new there, right? That bullet point is to remind you of stuff I've already told you. So again, using the flower as an example, it's not like there was purple flowers and white flowers and red flowers and whatever. There was only two alternative traits, in this case, purple or white. And the results of all these experiments led him to formulate several hypotheses about inheritance. And let's talk about them. Well, actually, sorry. Before we do, here's a picture from your book. Excuse me. Like I said, we keep talking about the flower color. Again, two alternative traits. It's either purple or it's white. That's it. Nowhere in between, no other colors. But these are some of the other things he looked at. Flower position. Were they axial, meaning they were, or excuse me, were they axial or were they terminal? Terminal means that it was at the end of the plant. Axial means that it wasn't. Seed color, either yellow or green. Seed shape, was it round? Was it wrinkled? I'm not going to go through those. You can see them. The point is, you don't need to know any of that. Again, just the point is that everything he looked at, everything he studied, came in two traits. Right? It was one or the other. Anyway, let's talk about the monohybrid crosses. Excuse me. What is a monohybrid cross? That is a cross between purebred parents that differ in only one character. In other words, everything we've talked about and all these little examples I've been giving you so far have been a monohybrid cross. Meaning, like, for example, he was looking at flower color, for example. Like, all right, this plant has a purple flower. This plant has a white flower. He didn't even consider all that other stuff I just showed you. Right? Maybe the seeds were wrinkled in one plant and smooth on the other. Maybe the flowers were terminal on one plant and axial on the other. Maybe the seeds were green on one plant and yellow on the other. Doesn't matter. He wasn't looking at that. Well, he did, but that's not what we're talking about. When he was doing a monohybrid cross, all that other stuff didn't matter. He was looking at the flower color, for example, right? Just the one character. When he did this, he noticed some patterns. So again, using the flower color as an example, if he bred, if you will, a purebred purple flower with a purebred white flower, he found that something interesting. Every single one of the offspring, 100% of the offspring, and again, he did this thousands of times, they all had purple flowers. Every time he mixed a white flower and a purple flower, purebred variety, they always had purple flowers. Never once was there a white flower. And this might not sound interesting to you because you're sitting here listening to a lecture and because we know about genetics now. But imagine if that was you doing that experiment. And like you just kept doing it and doing it and doing it. Like, where in the world did the white flower go? How come I don't see the white flowers anymore? And again, that was the observation. Going back to the scientific method here. The question then from that observation was the factor, was the factor for white flowers lost as a result of the cross? That was his question. And of course, if we were asking that question, we would say, was the gene for the white flower lost or the allele? But they didn't have those terms back then. So was the factor, whatever it was that was responsible for white flower, was it lost? That was his question. So to find the answer, he took it a step further, right? He had his F1 generation, which was from the crossing of the purebred plants. So then he started crossing the F1 generation. He took this F1 plant and crossed it with that F1 plant. And then he took a different F1 plant and crossed it with a different F1 plant, right? Thousands of times he did this. And by doing that, he found out that the answer was no. The factor for the white flower was not lost, even though 100% of the time in the F1 generation, it seemed to be lost because 100% of the F1 generation had nothing but purple flowers. Once he crossed that F1 generation and saw the F2 generation, he found out that, boom, there was that white flower again. The white flower showed back up with the grandkids, if you will, right? If those are the original, right? You got the original, then you've got the kids, then you've got the grandkids, so to speak. So no, the factor for the white flower was not lost. Not only that, but he also noticed that it came up in a very predictable ratio, which was 3-to-1. Now keep in mind, this picture is very misleading. He didn't do this once with one purple flower plant and one white flower plant and resulted in one purple flower plant and then planted that and had 4 plants. No, he did this thousands of times. So for example, if he did this, I don't know, with 100 plants, and then let's say this generation there was 1,000 plants, right? Not 4, there was 1,000. Well, then probably what? 75% of those thousands of plants, right? About 750 of them would be purple, and about 250 of them would be white. Never failed. Now, granted, the ratio was always slightly different. It wasn't always perfectly 75%, 25%, but it was close. And again, to this might sound boring to you because you're sitting here in a lecture and you're not biology majors. But to him, that had to have been fascinating because he's like, what in the world? Every time, never fails. Every time I do this, thousands of plants, I usually get that 3-to-1 ratio. So that had to have been interesting to him. Yeah, and again, like I said up here, like we said earlier, every time he did this, 100% were always purple. Never, ever, 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 ever could get a white. He kept trying, never got a white flower until he crossed that F1 generation with itself. And then he ended up right there with generally a 75% purple and 25% white. Now, this is just what he did. You don't need to specifically remember the details of this experiment. I'm not going to ask you questions like, when he did this experiment, what percent was white? What percent was purple? No, this is just an example. You will need to understand this idea of 75% and 25%, but we'll come back to that. I'm not going to specifically ask you about the experiments he did. So what he learned then was the gene, and again, he didn't call it a gene at the time, but the gene for the white flower did not disappear. It was just hidden when the purple gene was present. And even though your book doesn't tell you this, I can tell you how this works, at least in this case. What it happens is the gene for the purple flower literally says it's instructions on how to build the color purple, or to be more specific, how to make enzymes that make the color purple. But that's what the gene, the allele for the purple does, right? It's like, all right, this is how you make purple. But the different version of that gene, the allele for the white, it's just a broken gene. So instead of saying, hey, this is how you make purple, it just doesn't say anything. So it doesn't necessarily say this is how you make white. It just doesn't say anything. So if you have that allele, the allele that's supposed to make color, it just doesn't make anything. Therefore, obviously, if you have one gene that doesn't do anything, one allele that doesn't do anything, and the other one that makes purple, obviously you're going to be purple. Does that make sense? That's why it's not like light purple, because one's not producing white and the other one's producing purple. No, one's producing purple, the other one's not doing a thing. So again, he found that out. He also figured out from these experiments that F1 generation, right, so the kids, if you will, not the grandkids, not the parents, but the kids, the F1 generation plants carried 2 genes. Now, this is how your book describes it. One for purple, one for white. What we really know, and I'll tell you this later, as you already know from lab, technically that's one gene, 2 different versions of it, right? 2 alleles is what it carried. But for now, we'll keep it simple and say it had two genes, one for purple, one for white. That's a great place to stop. The last word for attendance will be outcast. Any questions? All right. I hope if you were not in lab on Monday, I hope and pray I will see you in lab today. so you can get your points. And I guess that's it. I will be online for office hours at 9 a.m.
Send them keywords.